us now, welcome. My name is Brian Runciman. I'm Head of Content and Insight at BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. We've got a really interesting debate lined up for this afternoon. We're talking about disinformation, the dangers of it. You probably noticed from the quite dramatic title, it can even kill. Well, of course, that is based on an excellent article that one of our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, wrote for us. Alexi Drew wrote for us a few months ago now after the Capitol Hill debacle, and the article got a lot of interest, and of course it's a very current issue. We were just talking before we started. There was a decision a few minutes ago about the decision of Facebook about its handling of certain ex-presidents who shall remain nameless, although I'm sure you can guess who that is. Before we start, what I'm going to do is get each of the panel to introduce themselves to you. Maybe a little bit of overview of what you do, folks, if you don't mind as well. And let's start with Alexi, please, as you wrote the excellent article for us that sort of kicked this process off. Hand over to you, Alexi Drew. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have to admit on the start that the title of that article was aimed to be as, in a way, content and attention grabbing as I could, which I'm glad to see that it had that effect. Maybe more academics need to take a leaf out of that book, or perhaps that's a problematic direction in all sorts of other ways. I am currently a research assistant, or research associate, I should say, at the Policy Institute at King's. Previously, I worked at the Centre of Science and Security Studies, also at King's. My work really focuses, or began, around cybersecurity norm construction and kind of policy interchange, but it broadened to include cybersecurity in an information operation and influence operation dynamic. The more I studied it, the more I realized there was significant interconnection between these issues. And since then, I've looked at varying types and risks to information health in Africa. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post a couple of months ago on Ethiopia. And I broadly look at all sorts of things in that area, which I'm sure we'll cover, but I'll pass on to the others before I take too much time.
Thank you, Alexi. Excellent. I'm going to introduce, or perhaps Alicia can introduce herself. Very careful to say that you're joining us from Canada, Alicia.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Alicia Wanless. I'm the director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I am also still endeavoring to wrap up my PhD also at King's College in London in the War Studies Department, where I research the information environment, how it is shaped by us, and attempting to find alternative models for making sense of that space.
Lovely. Thank you, Alicia. And I'm going to come across to Leonie, who's a little bit closer to home, for me anyway, just down the road in Reading. Leonie, could you introduce yourself for us as well?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leonie Haiden, and I'm a doctoral researcher at the King's Center for Strategic Communications in the Department of War Studies at King's College. And I'm also in the final months of my PhD at the moment. My key areas of study are terminology, the role of metaphor in strategic communications and discourse. And my research or interest in disinformation really started out in 2017 when I co-edited a book called Fake News, a Roadmap, when we were really starting to grapple with this idea of fake news and disinformation. And I've also been working on terminology around strategic communication, so really getting our terms right and getting on one page about what we're speaking about. So yeah, I'm excited to join this panel and looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Leonie. Well, I'm sure you'll agree, folks, so those that are watching with us live, that we've got some people here that know what they're talking about, and I'm going to quiz them a little bit, and I don't know what I'm talking about too much, but I'm happy to ask people that do. So that's what we're here for. Now, you'll know that this is live for the next 3/4 of an hour, so usually we have about a half-hour conversation. And any questions you'd like to put in, you're welcome to do. What actually happens in practice often is that questions come in during, and we just cover them as we go. So if anything occurs to you you'd like to ask the panel, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom. I'm sure you know where that is now. We're all very used to this Zoom approach now, aren't we? And so I'd like to start off, folks, with the first question we had written down for discussion was this. I'm just going to read this out. Content moderation versus free speech. Now, things are often sort of put in binary terms like that, aren't they? It's either one thing or the other. So the question I just posed here is the term versus even appropriate. And this is a word thing as well, of course. So that's going to come into Leonie's area as well. But perhaps we can start, Alexi, with yourself. Is it a binary choice here?
I think it's prominently posed as such, particularly by those in a way who want to perhaps distract from the useful direction and the application of content moderation. The first thing to bear in mind is that content moderation is not a new thing. It's essentially been applied to pretty much all social media platforms that we have all experienced since their foundation. There are variations. There are some platforms that are far more involved than others and have higher standards and higher engagement in content moderation than others. There are some that make the whole premise that they don't do it, but even then there are still things which restrain certain types of action, either implicit or explicit. But I think, I mean, I come at this from a kind of political science background and a political theory background, and I have a particular dislike of people who frame it as it's a matter of freedom of expression, because we understand it in a political science area and from theory, freedoms come with responsibilities. There's a balance here. So I think that for me, the term versus is not quite reflective of what we're actually discussing, that it is a balance of. And if you're looking at what the ultimate goal is, which is the provision of a platform or a means of communication which is safe, secure, and a benefit to those who use it, I think balance is a better way of looking at this rather than a competition between these two things. But that's my take.
Yeah, thank you. Alicia?
We might be rather dull if we continue to agree. We're starting out with that. So I completely agree with Alexi. I think that we too often look at these problems in a really binary black and white way, and the world doesn't operate like that. And the information environment especially doesn't operate like that. It's a big gray space with everything in between. Part of the problem that we face now is that with the advent of the web and social media, something's happened in society in which the norms that we had that might have governed the way that we behaved in person are not applying online quite the same way. So it's almost as if we've lost those norms and those rules of engagement that, kind of tried to govern or make society better over centuries. And so we don't have that now, and it's badly missing, and we're attempting to apply rules that really can't work in a very ungovernable space.
Okay, thank you. Leonie, can I come to you? Is nuance just difficult to achieve in these kind of environments?
Well, I think another way of kind of looking at this question and this versus idea of binary is to take a step back and actually think, what is the assumption we're making about how communication happens? And I think this content moderation, this emphasis on content that we've kind of taken up in recent years really suggests that communication is a kind of conduit. So we say something, we send an image, and what we send arrives in a certain place in the intended way. Well, actually, it can arrive in a lot of ways. It evokes different emotions, different reactions. So by talking about, communication products, content, all these different metaphors, you can see where I'm coming from here. We are kind of limiting the way we're looking at it. So this is just another kind of point I would raise in the way we pose this question. Yeah, I think the use of that metaphor has really been amplified by technology, because things do seem quite segmented. There are bits, there are bytes, right? There are tweets, there are messages. So we've broken things down much more through the technology. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, one of the reasons I put the question like that, to be honest with you, is that it's an awkward place to start, isn't it, when things are set as one against the other without any middle ground. One of the things that BCS are trying to do is take that more nuanced approach. Going back to Alicia's point, maybe that sounds a little bit dull, but we're trying to sort of deal with this as adults here, aren't we? So now we did a little bit of a, you won't know this yet, I'm gonna leap this on you. We did a bit of research amongst our members with a question just last week. The question we asked was whether platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and so on should ask for real ID so that people are genuinely accountable for what they say, but with caveats around public anonymity. 64% of our members felt that they should do that. I just wonder if you've got a view on that. And we've gone slightly from my original thing, but Alexi, can I come to you?
Well, so interestingly enough, there's a perception that anonymity is complete on the internet, and it's something that you can always. There's a whole meme of no one on the internet knows I'm a dog, right? It's one of my favorites. But
Yeah.
and you have to understand that if we go to one of the original social media platforms that we're all well aware of, Facebook, the terms and conditions of Facebook is that you have to use your own identity, your real identity. And in fact, they have a policy of removing those who misrepresent themselves or use incorrect names or in some cases photographs. So that platform already exists, that approach already exists. There was a good 5 years ago, there's a lot of academic work that talked about, and there still is, that talks about the changes in behavior that brought about with the level of anonymity provided by digital platforms such as that don't have this policy. And there is an undeniable facet of that. We are less inclined to hold ourselves to the standards of behavior and norms that both Alicia and Leonie mentioned when we don't feel the personal implications of that because there's this veil of anonymity between us. But I think I'd be avoidant of the concept that this is a panacea, this is the solution to the problem, because we have one of the world's largest and arguably one of the most damaging social media platforms to the issues we're talking about that already has that policy in place, and it doesn't necessarily have the output that we might want it to in this frame of the question.
Yeah. Okay. So it was deliberately, of course, a simple question to the members. We also got a lot of verbatim answers. We haven't gone through those yet, but I will do so at some point. And there's bound to be some interesting nuggets. There always is. Now we're not going to move on to solutionizing too much today because I don't think that we're even at that stage yet as a society. But I'd like to come on to the second point, particularly with Leonie in mind, about the language we use, the terminology we use in the debates here, whether we're all talking about the same thing even. Could you tell us a little bit about your work there, Leonie? Because that's the sort of thing you look at, isn't it?
Yes. So when I started to look at fake news around 2016, 2017, that term I think was on everyone's lips, and there was really very little agreement on what it actually meant. So was it really false information, or was it just used as an expletive to discount one's opponents, right? So the conclusion we came to was fake news is actually very it's not productive at all to use as a term, and I would discourage using it. So we came up with a classification instead, which said there's disinformation, which is false information spread intentionally. There is misinformation, which is false information spread unintentionally or due to an honest mistake. And what we really drew out there is that a lot of the false information we find online can actually be misinformation. But because we're talking about disinformation all the time, we're talking about this idea of there's a hostile intent behind it. There is also this quite binary view of it, or this kind of hostile actor model. And that is not always productive, because I think some of the misinformation that is being spread and shared is an expression of kind of more underlying issues in society. That could be distrust, that could be feelings of uncertainty, and people might not be sharing it because they think, this is true, but they might be sharing it to signal something, and they could be signaling their allegiance to a certain political view or leader, or they could be trying to antagonize their opponents. So this whole question of kind of truth versus falsity, it's not the only question in this wider issue, I think, but it tends to be focused on quite a lot. And again, kind of coming back to my earlier point, communication is more complex than that, and how something arrives, how something is processed by the receiver can be very different. So yeah, but I think that is my main takeaway point would be, don't use the term fake news. It's not helpful.
All right, well, that's interesting of itself. Thank you. Alicia, do you have a view on that, the sort of terminology side of things?
We have a massive problem with definitions and terminology, and this is really acute in policymaking, especially because even once academia manages to sort out the definitions that might work for them in the research that they do, which usually happens long after the fact of something to try to make sense of a situation, those don't necessarily translate very well for practical policy enforcing things at scale. So for example, misinformation and disinformation is a great example. One, because there is an active it's not a debate, but active discussions around the use and misuse of those words. The definitions that Leonie supplied are the exact same ones that most people use, but they end up getting interchanged, much because there is a bit of an idea that, disinformation that was deliberately spread might become misinformation when people unintentionally spread it and don't realize that it's disinformation. Now, what does that mean if you're going to try to do something at scale and stop this bits of content or behavior that is misrepresenting themselves at billions of pieces of content and users per day? This becomes really challenging because the platforms aren't necessarily going to be able to discern intent from lack of intent. The effect is still the same if it spreads at a high rate. And this just, kind of really highlights where our problem with words are in this space. But beyond that, I'd like to come back to something that Leonie said earlier, which really resonated. And this is the complexity around communications hasn't necessarily seeped into our understanding of it writ large as a society and among the policymakers dealing with it. And a good example of that is the use of the existing theory of information is all about transmission. It's all about trying to get this particular message and this bits to, where they're supposed to go, such that they might be understood from when it was sent. And this doesn't really explain the information environment. It doesn't accurately explain information as a whole and what it means to society and how much of it determines who we are, right down to our DNA, but also all the myriad ways it presents to us, from like a message to just knowing that when the sun sets, we might have a sense of what time it is. All of these things are information, and our thinking really hasn't gone so deep as to be able to explain that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, actually, that the way we've looked at the information environment, and especially online communication, I think for the longest time has been seen as the separate sphere from kind of the real life out there, and it isn't. And I think people need to wake up to that. And we're still operating kind of with this, there's cyberspace and there's cyber stores and cyber cafes. Well, that was very much the noughties vibe, I think, around the internet, but it's really no longer applicable. We walk down the street, I smell something, I hear something, I get a notification, I get a message from someone, right? I see a news poster, and all of that makes up our information environment. So you're absolutely right, Alicia. It is this much more holistic way that we need to look at this issue, I think.
I would just like to offer listeners a really good intro book if they haven't been looking at this stuff, and that's Luciano Floridi's Fourth Revolution. I find that it was like the best kind of like entry to how our society has changed and we're not really aware of it yet.
I was about to mention Luciano Floridi because I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he has this little expression on life, doesn't he? Which is basically life is a mixture of online and offline. That's just what it is now. Alexi, I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, exactly. On that point, like another one of my least favorite phrases is the separation between real life and online life, and it still crops up, even now, particularly in policy. Like policy is very much behind, and still almost seeks to forcibly create this division between ourselves online and ourselves offline. But that is a division which hasn't existed for a decade, if not longer. And that division, if it still exists, is becoming narrower and narrower and less concrete over time. So the fact that policy, which is meant to be, the operationalization of good thought and up-to-date thought and reality, ironically, is the most out-to-date part of this whole thing. And that for me is quite a significant problem when it comes to actually dealing not just with this particular issue of mis and disinformation, information health, but quite a lot of range of technology policy issues.
That's really interesting. Now, we've had a couple of comments in already. I'm going to come to the second one we had, or the third one first. And Mark Cook has sent this question, this comment in. Most news content is now opinion, but presented as fact. Does the panel have a comment? Now, this is about types of information again, isn't it? And hierarchies of information. Who would like to just comment on that remark? Alicia, Alexi, thank you.
I can have a quick start at it, and I think that this does come down into the whole. I mean, it actually goes to one of the other questions that you had in the chat that I was just checking a second ago. Is that there's the problems are outside of social media. So it amplifies it, and social media certainly influences the dynamics of the misuse of information, as it were. But a lot of those problems and the linchpins of those problems exist outside of these platforms, and some of those problems come down to an increasing inability of the readership or those who consume media to properly ground the source of media they're reading or consuming in its context, including, is this opinion or is this scientific data? What is the motivation of the person writing it? These critical media skills that some of us were taught and some of us weren't, and are better taught in some places in Europe and the world and are less well taught in others. And I think that that imbalance, that inequality of critical media skills is actually, again, another component which is focusing these other dynamics towards the problem that we now face of, well, people don't know what is and is not fact and are not capable themselves potentially of inquiring of that in a more detailed manner.
Yeah, thank you. Alicia.
So there's a couple of things to unpack in there. One is that, so if we take the information environment as a place where people and things process information to make sense of the world, then it's a space that over time, with the introduction of new technology, including alphabets, printing, this kind of thing, becomes more and more complex. As more things get added, it also becomes a bit louder because more people can engage and more people can share. So what we see right now is, I think, a long progression. It's not necessarily new in news media that there should be sensation to get, attention. Think of the yellow press, even in the English Civil War, the first Corantos, the first news things were really geared at sensation and kind of spreading fear and stuff because that sold and still sells. And so now what we have today is this amalgamation of a very complex, interconnected, global information environment in which attention has become the scarce resource. And that's what everybody's competing to win and get. And it's almost as if the more that we're plugged in, the more that we're exposed constantly, the worse that problem becomes. And so now you see, politicians in the West in particular who have almost become like celebrities and behaving like celebrities. You have media outlets that are after clickbait because that's what gets the attention, and they have to sell eyeballs and attention essentially. And so this is the kind of race to the bottom that we in modern society seem to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here that John Ryan has sent in: if you receive, amongst other items of information from a source, whatever it might be, something you know to be incorrect, does this make you more or less likely to suspect other information it offers you? I suppose that's about outlets undermining their own authority. Do you have a view on that, Leonie?
Yeah, I think that is a real problem, especially in today's environment, which was what Alicia was also just commenting on. I think disinformation has always existed, sensationalism has always existed. What has changed is really volume, speed, and access, I would say. And that obviously makes it very difficult for news organizations that do have a code of conduct and a code of, their process to not make mistakes and not sometimes, fall into kind of information traps, if that makes sense. And the same goes for, institutions who are communicating, governments who are communicating. So I do think that the increased awareness of disinformation can have the tendency to make people more suspicious, and that can go either way of kind of a healthy suspicion, right? A healthy critique of information, but also this kind of tending more towards conspiratorial beliefs, perhaps, that you cannot trust anyone and there is no truth out there. But I would like to kind of combine that with the previous question as well, and I think we like talking about education, right, in this context, and saying that, oh, we need to have better media literacy. And I think that is definitely part of the education piece. But the other part is really an understanding of science and statistics. So there was some research done that I think they did a survey in the US, and they said that 44% of respondents said they didn't feel that their grounding in science was good enough to understand the content they were given in the news, the scientific content. So I think that really shows that science and also studies around technology and statistics, I think, are really a place to that we need to amplify with young adults and children. I think also another kind of coming back on the sensationalism piece, Neil Postman wrote in the 80s about how he was concerned about television and the sensationalism there. And I recently reread that book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and it's amazing how topical it seems today. So I really recommend that as a kind of more long-term view of what thinkers have been kind of suggesting and worrying about for the previous decades already, even pre-internet.
Interesting. So I've got all sorts of things welling around my head now. First of which, perhaps I'll put this to Alexi, if that's all right, Alexi. Just thinking about this, the way that people that are experts communicate then. So, science for people to understand science communicators need to do it in a way that makes it explicable. Now, I'm thinking back 5 or 6 years to when it was sort of trumpeted that we'd invented teleportation because two entangled quantum states had reflected off each other, and it's a kind of version of teleportation. Now, some people think that we can teleport now, won't they? So that's because of how that was reported, right? You're muted, Alexi.
There we go. Yeah, there's definitely I think I was going to say there's a growing requirement for those who do science to be better at translating it to the public space, but I think that kind of gives the wrong impetus. There should always have been a need for those who do science, or those who work with those who do science, to translate the outputs of scientific research into an understandable space. The problem with what we're seeing now in the dynamic is that, and this kind of comes down to the mis and disinformation part and the separation between those two terms, is that there's a difference between unintentionally misinterpreting science as it's put out to you, and that can be very easy to do if the science is incredibly complex and the level, and it's not communicated in a manner which is easy for the layman to understand. There's a difference between that and intentionally using that complexity as a means of spreading disinformation. And we've seen similar things going on around COVID-19, that people and actors trying to spread disinformation in this space have purposefully used the fact that there is complex science behind what's being done right now in the research to mislead and make it harder for the targets of these acts and this information spread to understand that they are being misled. And that I think is another component. And this is why I think academics, speaking as an academic, have a significant responsibility to learn how to communicate not just to other academics. Because if we don't, we not only risk the innocent version of this dynamic where people unintentionally don't grasp what is being explained in terms of new science, but we also create opportunity for those who want to misuse that and the lack of understanding. And I think that both of those could be solved by academics taking a more involved role in properly translating their outputs to a lay audience. And that is not a skill most academics have, I'll be frank, but it's one that I think that should be developed much further.
Thank you. That's interesting. Now, we've had an interesting remark here from Roy Martin, talking about the cyber domain, largely non-geographical, but governed by multiple widely differing national legal systems and codes. What are the panel's views on effective measures available to hold people accountable for the information or disinformation that is published online? Now, COVID-19 is a good example, because some of the advice that's given, maybe for bad motives as well, is actually actively dangerous. So is there a level of post-distribution accountability that we should be taking into account? You'd like to, I mean, that's a big question, right? I know, but Alicia, do you want to have a bash at that?
I don't know if I have an easy answer. I mean, I think as it stands currently, if what one does not break a law, there aren't a lot of consequences beyond deplatforming. And in some cases, if society, I think if a group of people determine that what you've said is really offensive, there may be some public outrage that may also have some consequences, but it's not a very formal response at all. And this presents a challenge. But I guess coming back to, like, I think it was like your second question, which was on the anonymity, as anonymity, taking it away is the answer. And again, I felt like, here we are at an all or nothing kind of conclusion, that all we can come up with are like one size fits all solutions that are going to blanket the entire world and all the population that's connected. And that doesn't actually really make a lot of sense when we start digging down and deeper. And so I kind of wonder if the better approach to getting to a point where we have consequences for bad behavior is like a scaled and varied approach based on user roles and types, their size of following, how they're actually using a platform, right? So does a person really need to prove much of who they are to a platform if they're really only engaging with close family and friends, right? If the friends can identify who they are and they all agree that that person is who they claim to be, do they need to give over more identity? However, a person who has, 5,000, 10,000, 1 million followers has inherently more responsibility for their behavior as a key node within this network. And for them to mess up, have grave consequences, do we need to know that they did it intentionally? Or should there be a bit of a covenant for how they engage with the information environment having that platform? And by very nature of them, messing up, they've crossed a line. Now that would require kind of like advanced service agreements, but that may be one approach.
Okay, so like a sort of power users kind of idea almost.
Yeah, so we have this series at work called the policy ideas proposals article series, and we've solicited ideas from the community. Jonathan Herman was the first one who put an article in, and this was his idea, that if you essentially borrow basic concepts from other areas of communication like broadcast, you might be able to apply some basic kind of a licensing system to it, to have users, once they hit a certain threshold, maybe they have to take a test to show and demonstrate that they understand the responsibilities, and then when they mess up of that or go foul, they know what the consequences will be. And it would be a lot clearer for platforms to be able to then act against that. Of course, you have other issues once you dig into that is a politician who lies, is removing their lies and removing them from a platform also detrimental to democracy, because now people don't have the historic record per se. But I think there are ways to capture that without, giving them free rein to influence other people.
Yeah, thank you. Frederick Ng has sent a question. How does a platform judge what is truth if even the mainstream news are not necessarily true, maybe for political or geopolitical reasons? Of course, some platforms already do make judgments on these things, don't they? How do they go about that? Are they good models? The Facebook Oversight Board, for example? Alexi, you look keen to answer that.
So there are all sorts of different regimes, and this comes back to the one-size-fits-all issue that Alicia just raised, is that I would say that there is a sliding scale of responsibility to policing what is fact and what is not between social media platforms, and some of them do a lot more and a lot better than others, and there's potentially two actual dynamics here. There's more and better. They don't necessarily go together. If you were to take a good example in case, I'd say, for example, the use of independent fact-checking organizations to actually provide an external resource, and an independent one from the platform and from government and regional oversight, because that's kind of important, particularly if we look at what's going on in India and social media right now. That is a route to charting what is and is not fact. There are, however, worst case scenarios where fact-checking is done in-house, and then obviously you have the potential pooling of power in a way which is just not conducive. In a way, the problem we face here is that historically we might have said that who do we trust to moderate and apply and decide what is and is not true, and historically we might have gone the state and gone, yeah, it's the state's role to do this, that's what it's there for. These days that's not necessarily the case. In some cases, if you poll an audience, they'll say, I don't trust the state, I prefer industry to do it. And then other people will go, I don't like the idea of a large company telling me what is and is not true. And they're not, neither of these are wrong, right? It's incredibly contextual depending on what region you're in and what governance structures you're in, and the potential for things to change over time. It's very easy to say, right now, I trust my government or the industry or an independent body to do this. But will you always? And will it always stay the same? That's another question that makes this more complex. But there are mechanisms that allow, if they wanted to, social media platforms to externalize the decision of what is and is not true, and then decide how to apply their moderation policies towards that decision. And it varies significantly from one platform to another how that's done.
Excellent, thank you very much. John Ryan sent a little comment in about having reliable sources that we can recommend to our children. Part of that's about education, of course, isn't it? So that the questions you asked earlier, who's writing this, what might their motivation be, who pays them, these might be relevant. But funny enough, what crossed my mind on a sort of day-to-day level was Wikipedia, which people used to laugh at in the past. But of course, everything in Wikipedia has to be sourced, doesn't it? And the sources and credits have to be there so that you can check where all that stuff came from. I don't know if you have a view on that sort of. I know that's not news, right? It's not that instant, is it? But Alicia.
I mean, it is a kind of form of social media in the sense that a group of community, a group of users have come together to curate an encyclopedia. And they've had some really great successes in that way, having their community actually police each other and their content. And that's been very effective, but it's also a lot more manageable when you're dealing with a very fixed kind of ecosystem. So there's only a certain amount of, entries that they may have to deal with. There are only a certain number of people within that community, and they have a very strong sense of identity together. And so I think it's a great model. It's a great success story in terms of moderation, but it's not necessarily scalable for something like a Facebook or even a Twitter, where, you just don't have that level of policing on that level of content.
Yeah, thank you. Leonie, just thinking about this idea of how things are policed or overseen. So, Facebook have got their group. Recently, the government in this country set up several I can't think of the word. God, I've gone completely blank. They've been looking into several things that they've been accused of doing, all in a little bit in marking one's own homework sort of way. So how do we get a more dispassionate view?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult situation right now because a lot of the institutions, well, this has always been a difficulty, but especially now with the internet and this really fast and furious information environment, governments are in a position where they are much more vulnerable, I think. And not just governments, but institutions in general are much more vulnerable. And there will almost always be a counter argument, a counter fact posed against whatever they say. So I think it is high time that, be that journalistic institutions, academic institutions, science, governments, really reassert what they stand for and what their values are. And this goes to, I think, one of the other questions I saw in the Q&A box is that, yes, in the past, governments have done disinformation campaigns during war. There was a Ministry of Propaganda in the UK during wartime. That's when the term propaganda then also went into disrepute, right? So there have been campaigns of communication that there have been arguments about to what extent they were justified or not, and whether the use of untruths or white lies or is justified. So, but I think in the end, it's about accountability and about standing up for the values that underlie that decision, right? Underlie that decision to either say something or not say something. And I think there's that's a difficult decision to make, and you have to come out and say, this is what I stand for, this is what our institution stands for, these are our ethics, and this is in the end what we rely on, and that will upset a few people, and it's just about drawing that line in the sand. But I think there has been a general reluctance to do that. But there was another thing I wanted to add on this whole kind of this idea of Wikipedia and social media, and the difference. I think Wikipedia is almost a slow medium in comparison, if we think about it that way. But a challenge with our current information environment is that it is really the high sugar, high salt, high fat version of content consumption, if we use that metaphor. And the way it's set up is based on addiction, right? We are encouraged to consume these images and snaps and bits and lines and scroll through them and react to them as quickly as we can. And the platforms themselves encourage this kind of behavior. So I think that really puts some onus on the ideas that underlie this technology, the business models that underlie this technology, and to question that and to put pressure on that. Because if we say, the open information environment, this communication that is more democratic, more free, is the basis of liberal democracy, then we really have to think about, okay, what kind of technology really encourages that? So, yeah.
Lovely. When we release this as a video later, which we will put on the YouTube channel, I might rename it the high salt, high fat, high sugar media landscape. That's I like that. It's pretty snappy. Thank you, Lily. I'll swipe that later. moving on, one of the questions we had in our original themes here was about who needs to work together to give us these societally beneficial communications platforms, which fits in with the question that Nicholas Henderson just put in here about the fact that some governments don't really have it in their interests to get rid of misinformation because it benefits them. So we put a few ideas down there: government, big business, independent groups, philosophers. What are your views? The balance clearly isn't right at the moment. How can we redress that? Any thoughts, Alexi?
So I generally propose every time I get asked this question or a similar one that, and this is using current government language right back at them, that this is a whole of society problem.
Right.
If it's a whole of society problem, then in order to maintain the balance between and an effective balance, one that actually has the outputs of producing policy and decisions which are useful, should include as much of that whole of society and representation from as much of that whole society as possible. And this includes bringing in actors that government and particularly international institutions and governments are not necessarily keen on always working with. So this includes third sector, this includes the platforms themselves, obviously. I say obviously, but often it's not apparently that obvious that we can't just work against them, we need to work with them. And there are platforms that have recognized that requirement and are beginning to do so, which I think is great, but that needs to be encouraged. And it does make a difficult dynamic that having tried to work with platforms before on research projects and engage with them on these issues, my impression has been that there is, amongst some of them, a feeling that they have often been scapegoated with the it's all their fault that this thing has happened. Now, it's certainly partially their fault in many cases, but the problem is the way this has been framed, particularly in very high public or high publicity hearings and such, is a kind of a, I don't know, almost like a circus of accusations without very useful outcomes. And it makes good political television. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy watching Mark Zuckerberg pulled in front of a Senate hearing. It's interesting to see how it's going to be framed next and what Zoom background we'll get this time. But it doesn't help us actually create this whole of society group, global group, I would argue, at least to begin with, to actually work out how do we deal with these issues as a whole of society. And I think we need to get past the antics of big publicity stunts and actually start doing the work. And I think that's a little bit less interesting, but more important.
Well, I think that's a really good balanced answer. Thank you, Alexi. You've obviously given the answer a few times that came out very smoothly. It seems to me what you're saying is that social media, like art, holds a mirror up to society. So you can't just blame it on the platform, can you? One last question I'd just like to put to you. So we're nearly at time. So that's gone by really quickly. So that's been a fascinating conversation. Mark Templeton has just sent in this remark: much disinformation involves misuse of certain words. We're going back a little bit, but there's an interesting nuance here to cause an emotive response. Often this involves a total reversal of meaning. Wouldn't acceptable moderation also require moderation of meaning? Now, I think what Mark's probably referring to is the dog whistle sort of analogy, that some text can look on the surface to be very, very innocuous, but in fact just has little phrases. We know they mean something, for example, that's on the far right, but they've not come out and said it. Now that's a whole sort of different level of awkwardness, isn't it? Anyway, Leonie, this is your sort of area, I think. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the question of meaning is extremely difficult, right? Because it gets us into really the details of how communication happens and how what one person communicates is processed by the receiver and what kind of other factors join in there. But I think what Mark is probably referring to as well is just a general shift in discourse and shift in public discourse around political issues, around social issues. And I think that is definitely something that has been observed by social scientists and discourse analysts, and I think it is expressed partly in the use of, big, long, hefty words amongst elites, and kind of the lack of definition behind them. And this is something I think that we've observed right now as well in the COVID pandemic, is that this idea of democracy versus dictatorship, or freedom versus oppression. And you'll have people going on the streets in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. This is kind of what I've been observing in the past months a bit more closely, and they will call for, they're trying to take away our democratic rights, and this is the arrival of dictatorship. And you think, well, if you actually ask these people, what do these terms mean? What does democracy entail? What does liberal democracy mean? I think that is really something that where this cooperation and this all of society approach really also needs to work together, is really reminding ourselves and going back to kind of the roots of what we stand for in liberal democracies, the upholding law, the equality before the law, right, the basic freedoms, but how that translates to the modern world. And I think there's been probably a bit of a vacuum in that space since the end of the Cold War, I would say, because up till then there was this very clear us versus them idea when it came to liberal democracy, but it's something that really needs more thinking today.
Thank you. It seems that a lot of people's definition of democracy at the moment seems to be it's only democracy if I won, if my side won.
Yeah, or if it feels good, or if I get to do whatever I want to do, and if I don't feel limited. And yeah, I think that is something, education, government institutions, public discourse, speeches, journalism, all those things, I think here work together.
Yeah. That's our time pretty much, folks. I'd like to ask you each, perhaps just to make a closing remark on where you think the most productive next step would be. As I said, we're not going to solve all these problems today. That's not the intention, but we've raised some really interesting questions. What's the next route on the journey? Can I start with you, Alexi?
Mine, I think mine somewhat comes out of my more recent research into, if you like, information health outside of a European and US, North American context, is that there is significant variation on the information landscape outside of that space in Africa and Asia. And I think that we are missing a trick to not look at what that looks like and what the implications are for us. So I think that more work needs to be done looking at context of information health and mis and disinformation outside of a Europe and North American context.
Lovely, thank you. Alicia?
I think the biggest gap for me remains measurements. We talk a lot about influence operations, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, and really our understanding of it still kind of sits at, our understanding of medicine in the Middle Ages, where somebody goes and shares a campaign and suddenly that's, the reason why everything changed. And we don't have that kind of analysis to really back that up. We don't have great understanding of how the information environment works as a system, the effects of influence operations. The majority of that research focuses on mass media before, it doesn't include social media. And we have very little information on the efficacy of interventions. And part of the reason why we have this gap is because we need some sort of a mechanism to bring key stakeholders together to make that happen. There needs to be, stable funding. There needs to be ongoing access to data and cooperation with tech companies, which is extremely hard to achieve without rules for data sharing in place. You need academics with a variety of backgrounds to do that kind of measurement. Things like psychologists, computer scientists, sociologists, political scientists, and bringing them together to work together and speak the same language is often a challenge. But most importantly, we also need to always have a policy mindset, bringing this work home, that it guides how we're actually as a society going to come up with rules for dealing with this space. And that to me is the biggest missing piece that we need, some sort of a multi-stakeholder research development center.
Excellent, thank you. And Leonie?
Yeah, I think kind of building off of Alicia's final point, I think, yes, education and cooperation is a massive piece in this. Then I think more care should be taken in the kinds of metaphors we use when you talk about communications. And I say that it sounds quite airy-fairy, but I think it's really about giving people the sense that they are not purely vulnerable in this confusing, overwhelming space. And I think that goes to not just the idea of trust as people trusting institutions, but also institutions trusting the people and trusting their citizens. And that would then branch into another aspect, which I think is key, which is the sense of control. And I think this lack of control that a lot of people have felt, especially in this time of crisis, could find expression in education around the technology we're actually using today, because I think we're at a point in time where we are so immersed in a technology that we really don't understand very well, right? If the internet doesn't work in my home, I don't really know what to do. I can call someone, but I cannot fix it. I don't really know what my phone looks like on the inside, right? So we're dealing with a technology that we don't really understand. And I think that is just giving us all a sense of anxiety, I guess, a little bit, because we are so immersed in it and we are at its behest. We're kind of reacting to it, but we don't really know enough about it, I think. So yeah, that would be my main takeaway.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. So that's been a fascinating chat. Leonie, Alicia and Alexi, can I thank you so much for your comments, your input today. We didn't get around to the fact that a certain ex-president has stayed deplatformed today, but that's okay because that news broke about 5 minutes before we started. But I think that does demonstrate that this is going to be an ongoing conversation for a long, long time to come. I'm sure I can speak for all the members when I say we'd like to hear from you again on this subject in the future. But for now, I'd like to thank you very much and the audience for your questions as well and your participation. And I will bring this particular webinar to a conclusion. Thank you very much all.